Adam Merlin, president of Merlin Auto Group. Today we're going to talk about cost of ownership for one of my favorite Ferrari models of all time, the 308. And when you're factoring cost of ownership for one of these cars, you need to look at three things. The first is value, the second is pedigree, and the third is maintenance. So no different than any other time when we're talking about cost of ownership, the first thing we have to factor into is what is our entry cost? What are we going to pay for the car? They made the Ferrari 308 in this Pininfarina design from 76 to 85. And during that period, there was many different configurations. So it's a lot of information to digest to figure out why some of the cars on the market are $50,000 and some of the cars might be $500,000. The early 1976 cars are fiberglass cars. Those cars bring the biggest premium, kind of like cars today would bring with the 6-speed manual transmission. It doesn't necessarily mean it was the most fun to drive, it's the most reliable, it's the cheapest to maintain, but they made very few of them, and the fiberglass cars are the most collectible, so they're the most valuable. They also made carbureted cars from 77 to early 80. People say that these are also very collectible. They then made fuel injected cars, and then they made in 83 to 85 the quattro valve cars. Now while they made these cars, they all came with either a Berlinetta hardtop or a GTS, which is a Targa roof. So when you're factoring in whether or not you should buy one of these or which one you should buy, you should determine A, which do you want, if you prefer to have the removable top or if you like the hard top. But understand, they always made fewer Berlinettas, so the Berlinettas are always going to bring a premium. So to back it down, the 1976 fiberglass cars are going to be the most expensive. Second, the carbureted cars from 77 to early 80 and the quattro valve cars from 83 to 85 in the Berlinetta version, which is the hardtop, the non-removable roof, that's going to be the lowest production numbers for those sought after engines and designs, and those are going to be the most expensive and bring the highest premium and therefore stand the most collectability. The GTS versions of those carbureted and quattro valve would then fall next, followed by the fuel injected versions, which are actually still a terrific opportunity and pose a lot of value. The second thing you really need to consider when looking at one of these cars is the pedigree. And for these cars, it's a little different than others. Yes, pedigree does mean the number of owners, the extensiveness of the service records, but it's very important to know some of the nuances of these 308s to determine really the pedigree that you're looking for. Obviously, a car that's, they average over 30 years old, long-term ownership by the same person is very important. However, due to the construction of these cars, they're very prone to rust. So one thing that's almost imperative to consider when you look at one of these is the climate where it's spent most of the time. Rust is kind of like cancer. Once it's present, it's very challenging to overcome. So no matter how mechanically sound the car is, if it's completely covered in rust, it's always going to be a challenge for you, and that's something you definitely want to look at. Service records are very important, incredibly important when it comes to this, but the completeness of those service records and really buying the car from somebody that understands how to maintain one of these cars is more important. And we'll talk about it in the final segment, but there's a big difference between a major service on one of these cars and a belt service on one of these cars. Not all services are created equally. So when you look at the pedigree, you want to see the climate where the cars lived. You really want to see long-term ownership. But again, most importantly, you really want to look at the physical condition of the current car that you're looking at, because just because it doesn't necessarily have the same owner for 10 years, or just because it doesn't necessarily have a stack of service records, it could still possibly be a very good car. The last thing to consider when you're factoring the cost of ownership in one of these cars is maintenance. We always say maintenance is so important, and it's not just the maintenance that you do, but it's really who does it. This, for example, is a carbureted 308, which is a very, very, very unique type of car that you have to have a unique skill to know how to work on. And not every service, people can just consider timing belts. That's what everybody worries about with Ferraris. Just because a car's had a timing belt service doesn't necessarily mean that it's had a major service, and that is very specific on these 308s. A major service includes things like cam seals, cam covers, stuff like that, which is 20 plus extra hours worth of work, whereas just slapping on some belts and calling it a major service is a very different thing. So when you're factoring in the maintenance on one of these cars, you really want to understand A, who did it, make sure the person that did it was qualified to do it, knows what to look for, and then B, the nature of those services. Because I'll tell you from experience, these cars are really not that difficult or expensive to maintain as long as you get one that doesn't have an extensive list of deferred maintenance. If it's had its major services, if the cam seals have been done, if it's had regular timing belt changes, and then all you're really looking at each year is just typical oil services. Little things go wrong here and there, but it's really not cost prohibitive. When it gets really expensive is when you've had a bunch of belt services that people are calling majors and none of the other stuff is done. You get in there and it's hours upon hours upon hours of work that you have to do to get that car back up to snuff. Now, I will tell you from firsthand experience, just because a car has service records that stack this high doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get in there and that car is going to be perfect. So most importantly, again, you want to look at the specific vehicle. You want to know what you're looking for. You want to know where to look underneath to see if certain areas are leaking that would give you an indication that the cam seals haven't been done. You want to really try to figure out and evaluate the specific car, because obviously that weighs into your entry price and then what you're going to have to do to it once you buy it.